The restaurant went silent. A glass of cold water dripped down the woman's trembling chin, soaking her floral dress, her hands instinctively clutching her belly, protecting the life growing inside her. Every eye turned toward her, but no one moved. The waiter stood frozen, his anger fading into disbelief at what he had just done. He had no idea that the woman standing before him, the one he had just humiliated, was the wife of one of the most feared and respected biker gang leaders in the entire city. And that this single cruel act would change his life forever. Before we dive into this powerful, real-life inspired story of kindness, anger, and redemption, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Kindness Universe, and comment below if you believe that what goes around comes around. The city of Steel Ridge was never kind to the weak. Its streets were lined with smoke, noise, and people who had forgotten what it meant to care. Amid that chaos, there was one small diner, Tony's Grill. It was the kind of place where tired workers came for cheap food and cheaper conversations. Lila walked in that morning, her hand resting gently over her swollen belly. She was 8 months pregnant, and her face glowed with the soft tiredness of a woman who had lived through storms and still smiled at the rain. Her husband, Jake Ironhand Turner, was the leader of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club, a man both feared and admired. But Lila wasn't like him. She wasn't the leather-clad type. She was quiet, kind, and full of grace, the kind of woman who softened even the roughest souls in the biker circle. That morning, Jake was out on a long ride to settle some business in another town. Lila had been craving pancakes, simple, sweet comfort, so she decided to walk to Tony's. It was only a few blocks away, and she liked how the morning sunlight made the diner's glass windows shimmer like gold. But she didn't know that inside someone else was having a bad morning, a man named Eddie, a 27-year-old waiter who had given up on kindness long ago. Eddie wasn't a bad man, at least not always. But life had been cruel to him. His mother was sick, bills were piling up, and he'd just been yelled at by his boss for being late again. Every day felt like a weight pressing on his chest, and somewhere along the way, his patience had turned into bitterness. When Lila walked in with her soft smile and glowing belly, Eddie barely glanced up. She found a small corner booth and sat down slowly, adjusting her dress and taking a deep breath. "Excuse me," she said kindly. "Could I get a glass of warm water first, please?" Eddie grunted. "Warm water? You mean tea?" "No," she replied gently. "Just warm water. Cold makes me feel dizzy." That simple, innocent request irritated him. He muttered something under his breath, rolled his eyes, and slammed a glass of ice water on her table. "Here, that's all we got." Lila looked up, her eyes soft but firm. "I'm sorry, but lady," he snapped. "It's water. Be grateful. I got 5 other tables to serve." The diner went quiet. A few customers looked up, sensing the tension. Lila swallowed her pride and nodded. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want stress. Not for herself, not for the tiny heart beating inside her. She gently pushed the glass aside and waited. But for Eddie, her silence felt like judgment. He saw her soft eyes as pity, the one thing he couldn't stand. His anger built, bubbling from deep inside until finally, in a burst of frustration, he grabbed the glass and splashed it across the table. Cold water spilled everywhere, soaking Lila's dress, dripping from her face. "Oops," Eddie said sarcastically. "Guess it slipped." The diner gasped. Lila sat there, frozen. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Tears welled in her eyes, not from the cold water, but from something deeper. Humiliation, fear, shock. Then, as if destiny itself had been watching, the diner door creaked open. A shadow fell across the floor, heavy boots, a leather jacket marked with the Iron Saints emblem, and a voice like gravel and thunder. Jake Turner had just walked in. He wasn't supposed to be back for another day, but he decided to surprise his wife after hearing her craving for pancakes during a phone call that morning. He never imagined walking in to see her drenched, trembling, and a crowd staring in silence. "What happened here?" Jake's voice cut through the air like a blade. Eddie turned, his arrogance melting into panic. Sir, it was an accident." Jake's jaw clenched. "You threw that water?" The diner was dead silent. You could hear the ticking of the wall clock. The air felt heavy, electric. Jake took one slow step forward, then another, his boots echoing like thunder. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, he just stared, with eyes that had seen wars, betrayal, and pain. "Apologize," Jake said, his voice low but sharp. "Right now." Eddie's lips trembled. I didn't mean, apologize to my wife." Lila stood, her hand on Jake's arm. "Jake, please, don't." Her voice was soft, filled with compassion even in her humiliation. "He's not worth it." Jake looked at her, then at Eddie, a broken man hiding behind his anger. For a moment, the rage in Jake's eyes softened. He took a deep breath and whispered something only Lila could hear. "For you. Only for you." Then he turned to Eddie. "You should thank her," he said coldly, "because if she weren't standing here, you'd be crawling out that door." Jake took Lila's hand and led her outside. He helped her into his bike-side car, his hands trembling with anger and heartbreak. He wanted to protect her from the world, but he couldn't protect her from people like that. Inside the diner, Eddie stood frozen. The other customers stared at him with disgust. His hands shook, his chest tightened, and suddenly, the anger he always used as a shield began to crack. He looked at the spilled water, the empty booth, and realized what he'd done. Not to a stranger, but to a mother, to a kind woman who hadn't done anything wrong. That night, Eddie went home to his tiny apartment, where the smell of medicine filled the air. His mother, weak and frail, asked softly, "Rough day, son?" He couldn't answer. He just sat by her bed, his eyes heavy with guilt. For the first time in years, he cried. The next morning, Eddie walked to the biker clubhouse. It was reckless, maybe even suicidal, but he needed to find Jake. He needed to apologize, not just for the act, but for the man he had become. The clubhouse was surrounded by rows of gleaming motorcycles and tattooed men with hard faces. When Eddie arrived, they surrounded him immediately. "What do you want, waiter?" one of them growled. I need to talk to Jake Turner." The crowd laughed. "You got a death wish, huh?" But Jake, standing at the far end, heard the commotion and stepped forward. When he saw Eddie, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, then curiosity. "What are you doing here?" Eddie took a deep breath. "I came to say I'm sorry. Not because I'm scared, but because your wife didn't deserve that. Nobody does." Jake stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You got guts, I'll give you that." He turned and called inside. "Lila?" She came out, her face calm, her hands resting on her belly. When Eddie saw her, he lowered his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I've been angry for so long I forgot what kindness looks like. You didn't deserve that. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it." Lila smiled softly. "Thank you for coming, Eddie. That takes courage." And in that moment, something inside Eddie broke free. The bitterness, the hate, all of it began to fade. Jake reached into his pocket and handed Eddie a folded piece of paper. "There's a job at my garage. Good pay, hard work. If you're serious about changing, show up tomorrow." Eddie blinked, stunned. "You'd trust me after what I did?" Jake shrugged. "Everyone deserves one. Chance to make things right." Months passed. Eddie started working at Jake's garage. It was hard at first. The other bikers didn't trust him, and he didn't trust himself. But slowly he earned respect. He showed up early, stayed late, and never forgot the lesson he learned that day. Lila gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and when Jake asked what they should name him, she smiled and said, "Hope." Years later, when people talked about the day a waiter threw water at a pregnant woman, they didn't talk about anger or revenge. They talked about forgiveness, about how one woman's grace changed a man's life. Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with fists or fury, they're fought with kindness,